You know, it's been a pleasure of mine to be involved with Calvin Castine and this program called Our Little Corner for about 8 years, a little over 8 years. All the programs are fun, interesting, and educational, but some have a special meaning for me. And the program we're going to do today has a very special, deep, and profound meaning for me, and will, I'm sure, for all of you, the viewers out there, whether you know Robert Booth or not. You've heard him speak, you've heard about him, you've seen him. He's been around this community for many, many years, but this story has to be told, and finally we're going to capture it.
Let's go to work.
On tape. How are you, Robert?
I'm holding up very well.
I think it's wonderful, and I thank you so much for inviting us here today. We've talked about doing this for a long time. We finally pinned each other down, didn't we?
We've done it in pieces over time.
We have certainly been there where you were many times down through the years. You've been such an integral part of this community. Were you born here?
Absolutely. Well, I was born in the town of Plattsburgh, but yes.
You mind telling us when?
1923. I'm having a birthday next week.
Are you really? We're recording this in early June, or July, early June, July, the first
of July.
First day of
You're
July,
on.
2005.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to believe that it's July already. We've already had, I hope we haven't already had all of our summer. But anyway, you were born where in the town?
Next to Salmon River on the south end of town.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your
I
mother
was
and
very
father.
small. How would I know that? No, my grandparents acquired part of the Gilliland property.
Oh, yes.
David Glenn lives there now. The Royal Savage Inn was part of it, and my grandparents established that, built a number of summer camps. At the time of the First World War, with the idea that they were going to house families of trainees who came to the Plattsburgh camps. And of course, after that, they just continued. It was a large part of the way they made their living. So we were there. My father was the son who stayed home, so he got all the jobs that had to be done, and we just spent summers there. And I arrived there, in fact, with the family doctor in place, and it's been history ever since.
Well, that is that's an historic place.
Well,
We've done
it is.
we've done interviews
Right.
down there with David and
Yeah.
with other people, and we've watched the metamorphosis of the old Royal Savage Inn as they
Right.
stripped away the newer stuff
Yes.
and left the
Yeah.
original structure, and it's been interesting to watch
Right.
down
Right.
through the years. That's a nice home too.
Oh, it is. Dave's done a fine job with it.
Yeah.
It was, well, it was in original shape. They shut down that building in the winter and lived in the kitchen in one room. My grandparents didn't, but there was always somebody there overseeing, and they spent winters in there. It was cold. My brother tried to live there in his early days, and it was a different life compared to,
How big a family? With
Who?
you, how many siblings did you have?
just my brother Kit, who is much more famous than I am, because
Oh, here we go.
See him
Here
every-
we go.
every September 11th doing the Battle of Plattsburgh.
To the uninitiated, that would be Christopher.
Yes, that's right.
Christopher Kit Booth.
Mm-hmm.
And many people are familiar with your son Matthew,
That's right.
who is a dear friend of mine, and we were standing in a grocery store
Well, he kept you on the straight and narrow as chief
Oh.
of police.
all through the years, and we've talked about doing this interview with you, and the last time I said, you tell your dad, I'm going to call him, we're going to get him together, and we're going to finally go through all the old scrapbooks
He did.
and pictures, and he did, and we did. And we're here today to talk about the life and loves of Robert Booth here in Plattsburgh. Stay with us. We're going to have a good day. So, how long did you live around here as a young man?
Lifetime until I went away to school. So I left the community, well, essentially at age 18.
And you still lived in that area at 18?
No, we were in Plattsburgh, down next to the Kent Lord House. My grandparents lived, my parents lived. The brick house, apartment house next to the Kent Lord House.
The
was
one that
old.
burned? The one that
Yeah,
burned?
yeah.
Oh.
My grandparents owned that. My parents rehabilitated the barn out back where George Belucas now lives.
Of course, and he's been there for many years.
Yes, he has. Yes, he has. And so I spent my growing up life there after age 6. Previous to that, we lived where the Verizon telephone building is. There was a big apartment house there that my grandfather owned.
Interesting.
So that's where I started living in the city. And then we moved down on Cumberland Avenue, Kent Lane it's called. And I grew up there through high school and then went off to college and Army and so on.
That must have been almost like an estate back in those days.
There was a lot of acreage that Kent Lloyd House actually owned back there. They must have had 5 or 6 acres. It's all developed now, but it was open fields then, and no animals, but it was open fields, and our family property, not my parents' property necessarily, had probably 3 acres, 3 houses on the street, 2 houses on the street. I'm sorry, but it was quite a spread. Yes.
It's still a beautiful place down there. I love to
yes.
drive by.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
I love to go and visit George back there. Been to some pretty good functions at his house
I imagine.
back there. It's
And
just a
stories
nice place.
told, I'm
and,
sure.
Oh, tall stories. Lots of stories.
Yeah.
So you went to high school here in town?
For a year, yeah. Then I got shipped. I went to Northwood School,
Oh, you did?
graduated from there, and then went to Yale University, where I was when the war started. Pearl Harbor happened while we were there.
In school. You started to tell me that before the tape began. Now tell me, you were in school, and
Right.
were you and Helen together then?
No,
No.
no. We knew each other. We've known each other since we were in 4th grade.
Don't you love it? Don't you love it?
We, after the big fire at the normal school,
Yeah.
when Hawkins Hall was built and contained the whole teachers' college, why, we were in the first 4th grade class that opened up the building and went on from there.
Amazing. No kidding.
Yeah.
There's a piece of history all by itself.
Well, it is. She lived down Court Street, so all the names you see on buildings on that campus were her next door neighbors. I mean, those famous people
Yeah.
lived on Upper Court Street, faculty and citizens.
Isn't that wonderful? Is that what we now call West Court Street?
No, it's
No.
Court Street,
It's Court Street.
right up to the front door
Of Hawkins.
Hawkins. Yeah.
I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah. But Dr. Hawkins lived there, and Dr. Ward lived there, and the Hudsons, and Ben Feinberg, and Harry Kehoe, and they're
Talk
all-
about names.
Yeah, they're all
Dropping
emblazoned
names.
on buildings around the campus, and she lived right there at the corner of William Street, which is 1 block down.
Isn't that wonderful? The fact that you still end up almost on that end of town
Yeah, well,
all these years
it's
later.
even smaller than that because 1 block up, it's 2 blocks in there. 1 block up is a brick building on the right side, where in fact my father was born.
Isn't that wonderful? So it's going right around in
Well,
a
it
circle,
goes-
isn't it?
Yes.
And
yes.
you sometimes you meet yourself, don't you?
You do. You do. Yeah.
Isn't that neat? Your dad was born right nearby.
Yeah.
So anyway, we got you through school. You went through Northwood, and from there you went directly to
Yale University.
Yale.
Mhm.
And then what?
Well, then I had a military career that began fairly soon. Then what? Then what? I've got.
But in
No.
Yale, you got a degree in Yale
I didn't
before?
get a degree in Yale. I got accelerated, and I was a certified junior by the time I was gone. But I was in and out of that campus a couple of times before I even got to that point. So that then after I came back to the States, I did not return to Yale. I, by that time, quickly acquired a wife who has been around here lately, and there were things to do. There were things to do, like finding out how to earn a living, and my father was very concerned about that, so I got pushed into law school, and that was accelerated too, so I left there and came back home in 1948.
That was all after the war.
That was after the war, yeah.
So many experiences. Pearl Harbor, of course, changed lives
Absolutely.
forever and ever. And
Absolutely.
We've heard a lot about your generation. Thank God there are still lots of you stalwarts
Well,
and survivors around for us to interview.
there are some survivors, and thank goodness we're stalwart. There's a lot that aren't, and there's a lot who have departed.
Yeah.
This, for me, is the year of the 60s, because it was 60 years since I went through a war and was freed. Shortly thereafter, we were married, August 4, so that's a 60 this year.
Wow.
This year was the 60th reunion at college, because I was a class of 1945, which still pulls itself together for reunions, but the class, those who finished, came back over a period of 5 years. And they graduated at different times, not all together, but they still have that feeling of being a class of
sure.
45. And it's very interesting because the Hale and Hardy ones have got just fantastic stories to tell now, and those that are able, it's fun being with them. They used to have, in all previous reunions, of which I haven't attended many, they often needed to prove points about how accomplished they were and things like that. Now they don't have to.
Isn't that amazing?
Just sit back and they're very comfortable, interesting people. Much better than it used to be.
But a lot of people who know you and know your distinguished career as an attorney in this town, I'm sure don't know what you went through in that relatively short period of time from the time you got in the service until you got out. It's amazing how much life you can live in
You
a
bet.
few years. You had no idea when it started. How did you get attached to the service in the first place?
I come from, you might say, a military family. My father and my uncle were in the First World War. My mother's brother was a professional soldier. I'm here because he was stationed at Plattsburgh Barracks, and she came to visit.
Oh, gotcha.
And there was my father hanging around the gate.
Sure.
And one thing led to another. My aunt, my mother's sister, married two different military officers. So there's, in the end, by this time, there were 3 colonels in my background. And my father knew perfectly well that a war was coming, and so college conversation was largely about where was their ROTC to get a running start, and that swung the decision about really where I went. I was able to get in, but that was the reason. So there I was, and in 42, Pearl Harbor was the end of 1941. By the middle of 1942, we were, the Army had enough invested in us in ROTC that we were preserved, so to speak. So we were forced to join the enlisted reserve, and were literally in the Army as buck privates, still going to school, but in the enlisted reserve. They sent us to basic training in 1943, which was finished in October. We had more invested in us then, so we came back to college under a program called the ASTP, which was a catch-all where fairly well-educated people were sent to college with the idea that they could be converted to something exceedingly useful. And that was a storehouse where we were kept for 2 months, perhaps like that, and then we became eligible to go to Fort Sill to be trained as officers. So that I was finished with that with a group of others by June of 1944. June 3rd, I was in my front yard. No, June 6th, I was in my front yard. I was commissioned in June 3rd. And heard the reports of D-Day and was glad I wasn't there. But that was when I was full-fledged. After that, by 1st of July, I was assigned to the 87th Infantry Division as a filler. They were stocking up so they'd have their full 15,000 men to send overseas. And so I filled up a slot in the field artillery. That was the whole game. And we were shipped in October, went out of New York City, and went to England, unloaded in Liverpool and unpacked. And by mid-December, we were on the move and on LST and across the English Channel for France. Rode up the River Seine on our LST, which is a snake's track going into the heart of France, and unloaded at an ancient city called Rouen, right on the front steps of the cathedral, which had been protected. It wasn't fought over. There was an understanding among the forces that it would not be damaged, and it wasn't, and we drove off this LST. Going over across the ocean, we traveled in a ship called the Louis Pasteur, which was a French cruise liner that had fled when France was occupied, had fled to the two little French islands off Newfoundland. I've forgotten their names. The British captured it there, converted it to a troop ship. They ran the ship. We were the passengers, and had left New York Harbor in a convoy to begin with, but then it was fast enough that we went alone, which is a different kind of a feeling.
Yeah,
The
it is.
submarines weren't gone by that
Yeah.
time, and we busted the seas in the ocean, and everybody had a real bad time with that, but eventually apparently leaned south and got into tropical water, which means sort of the Azores, and then went up the coast where overhead air cover protected us for several hundred miles up into England. But we had one incident going over where the ship was mounted with cannon to protect it. One of our artillery gun crews was called to serve that gun, to learn how to use it and be ready to operate it, and there were others similar. But this gun was up forward, and there were wooden shields built around certain parts of the ship to shield the lighting during the dark. It was possible to black some parts out, but not that, so this shield was built. The gun blast, when they first fired it, blew in this wooden cover and nailed our supply sergeant. A board hit him in the head, and he was badly injured. He had splinters driven into his head. We had the medical staff on our ship, and they attended him alone in the open ocean. in the dark, however, that was good, but they did surgery on him, and we sat still in the Atlantic Ocean for as long as it took to fix him up.
Isn't that amazing?
Well, that's a lot of holding the breath.
Oh, boy.
But it worked out okay, and that got us to Liverpool, where we unloaded. But it kind of, well, nothing happened.
I wonder if he survived the war. Did you
Oh,
ever?
yeah, I'm sure he did. He wasn't fatally injured. He just was, he never came back to the unit because he was badly hurt, of course. It took us 7 or 8 days to make the trip, I think, all told. But yeah, it was fast, and if it ever had stabilizing equipment in it, ships now, have got stabilizers. This did not. It had when it hit high seas, it hit in sort of a corkscrew fashion. It went like
So
board.
you were doing a little rocking and rolling, huh?
Yeah, you can tell. That quite a number of people were distressed for 7 days.
Distressed is a kind way to put what
Yeah.
happened to people, I'm sure.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You had never taken an ocean voyage like that before, had you? Or had you?
No, I'd been down the Atlantic coast from New York to Norfolk one time, and it was a little bit like this, but not like the Atlantic in late October. Yeah, late October.
You know, it's one thing to tell this story now, and you've got retrospect. You can look back and put it all the pieces into place. But then, do you remember what it was feeling like when you were on that journey? Did you have any clue
No, we were clueless.
what you were going into?
We were clueless, absolutely clueless.
That's important to point out for young people today.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we have a lot of history behind us, and many people who get into the service now know exactly what the picture is. They know where they're going. It's a whole different world of communication now.
You got a good point started there. Helen and I have remarked so many times that any control that we might have had at the age of 18 of our lives stopped. We no longer lived the life that we wanted to live. We didn't have any choices, and we went in lockstep until the middle of 1945. We were not in control of our lives. We didn't have to worry about anything except what was in the future, but what to do with it, or how to act, or how to occupy your time, or anything like that. It was just lacking from our lives. And that is profoundly different from, well, in a way, we suffered for our children. And now we would suffer even more because of the choices they have to make and the confusion there is, and the lack of certainty about anything, and the choices they need to make, and they don't have a clue how to make. Well, we didn't have a clue how to make choices either, but it was all done for us.
It was a complicated time, but it was simpler in many ways.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
And it's hard.
We didn't even have to worry about an automobile because we had ration tickets, and nobody spent money riding around on ration tickets.
Well, that's for sure. You did worry about where your next bowl of sugar was going to come from.
Well, sure, sugar and meat,
whether you could ever
things like
find
that.
used tires
Yeah.
for your car,
Well,
or
yeah.
a car for that matter.
Oh yeah, that's another story. But this just shift gears here. The rationing system brought back the memories, which I didn't know then, I know now, of the days of Prohibition, when the black part of our economy here, which was really important to this area, was bootlegging, an illegal product. Well, there was plenty of black marketing into Canada and out that went on, and you might say everybody got a piece of it if they could, as far as the benefits. And it definitely was an underground economy, and it went on.
You know, we've talked about Prohibition before and interviewed people who were there and remembered it, but I haven't thought about the black market during the Second World War, because in those days I lived down in Westchester County, so that wouldn't have been a factor, but I can now understand what you're saying.
Well, when you consider we're next to another nation, it makes a big difference, and it goes right back through the history of this area. Every time there was a war, I mean, my wife's family got in big trouble with the British in 1814, I think they got it, Murray's Raid. Which you've heard about. They got caught because they were dealing on both sides. That's a whole other story. We can sit and do that later. But,
oh my goodness.
black marketing was a big factor in our world here.
So you showed me a book before we started. Does this this is part of your training before you went, right?
That was while I was still in college, yes.
Yeah, look at this. Let's take a look at this. Tell me about this book. And
well, among other things that were decreed by the university, which was training people physically. There was forced physical education and sports and gym for everybody. That was one thing that changed. There was no choice. You went and hardened yourself up. But we in the ROTC and anybody else were taken under the hand of the wrestling coach. And this thing is the study book we had because he taught us jiu-jitsu, which meant personal combat and how to disable an opponent. And so we were all doing that, and that is a picture of somebody in uniform, and these
Sure.
the illustrations are someone in uniform.
Oh,
I
yes.
don't know who those people were, but that was part of what was going on. And we all put in our time in the gym or on the track or something. That was university policy, that happened. This was military.
1943.
Yeah. Let me tell you another.
It smells musty.
Wait.
It smells musty like
It is.
1943.
The ROTC was field artillery. It was in the day when soldiers were training with broomsticks and wooden guns, and the artillery unit at Yale University used horses. We were trained on horse artillery.
Come on.
Yep. We had
Had you ever done any horseback riding before that?
very, very little.
I love it.
We were, this is the training book about equitation, how to deal with horses. And we learned how to deal with horses, but I drew a horse called Gus, who had been at it, I think, since the First World War, and he knew exactly how things were supposed
Did he?
to be done, and how I was not going to have anything about it to do.
Somewhat different from your own opinion at times? Is that what you're telling me?
He was a big guy. Field artillery teams were 4 horses. They could be 8, depending on what they were towing. And they were not controlled by someone with reins. They had a rider on the left-hand horse. Each pair had a rider who drove them, and there was the lead and the swing, which was in the middle, and the wheel horse, who was up against the wagon.
Mm-hmm.
The wheel horses were bigger because they were the guys that were the brakes. There were brakes on the equipment too,
Sure.
but they got the first load. The traces between them were not stiff. There was only one team that was braking. But we learned all about that, and we had cannons that were just like those in front of Post 20 American Legion.
Sure.
The French 75s. The markings on them were in French, and they had ball-bearing wheels, though. They'd been reconditioned for modern use.
Oh, yes.
But we trained that way in the early days, and we learned about motor vehicle maintenance at that same time.
I never would have known until you told me today that you would have to have that equestrian type.
We did
Training?
then. That's all that was available.
And you probably
Any-
never used it again, did you?
No,
Of
You
course.
could have.
Like some of the math
No,
courses I took.
you could have, because a part of what there was in the artillery was a pack howitzer that was used for mountain warfare. And the ski troops that you heard
Oh,
about.
yes, the famous ski troops.
Yeah, Senator Dole was in that unit.
Oh,
And
yes.
numbers of people from here in the North Country that I personally knew. They had to carry their artillery into the mountains, so they had small pieces, 75 millimeter, that broke down into 4 sections, 1 per mule. And that's how they had to know how to assemble and disassemble and pack that, because if you've heard about putting loads on mules or horses, they know exactly what's right, and they won't do anything if it isn't right. Like Gus, they were much smarter.
Ah, yeah.
And so that was another part, and given a circumstance, I could have been doing that, but and what I learned would have been some help, but not many got that assignment.
So you didn't know exactly where you were headed on that ship.
No, we knew it was Europe, and there was only one place in Europe you were bound to be, but no, we didn't have any idea. We unloaded and got ourselves together, and we moved east to the area of Metz, which is midway across northern France, and if you picture Alsace, Lorraine, which are the 2 northernmost provinces of France, they project into Germany in sort of a peninsula. And they have been owned by one nation or the other for 800 years. They trade off. The population is either Germanic or French, and you don't know which you've got. And it's the village names are French or German, and so we ended up partly set up inmets firing on forts that had been bypassed. There were a number of large forts that go back to probably the Franco-Prussian War that were still occupied and still used, and they were cornerstones in the Maginot Line, the defensive line the French had. Or no, they'd have been in the West Wall. They were German occupied. So they were the German keystones. But they were bypassed and were cornered and wouldn't quit. So our job was just harass them until they gave up. There wasn't any active attempt to take them. And that's how we got started. The units, say regiments, of which there were 3 in a military division, gradually worked their way over a period of time before they came together at one area and operated as a division. So they were doing different things.
So what unit were you in?
What
unit were you in?
I was in a field artillery battalion, and our mission was to provide cannon support and observer support to a particular regiment. We were tied to one regiment. Another battalion, of which there were 4, was attached to the 3 regiments, and we had an extra battalion of field artillery that helped everybody. It was the bigger kind of a gun than we had. So we always worked with the 347th Infantry Regiment as in supporting them, and I had on the chart tables of organization. We had different classy titles, and second lieutenants could be motor officer or survey officer, I think. That didn't mean a darn thing.
Oh, yeah.
Because the active word was forward observer, which meant you served with the infantry, really.
Sure.
Not all the time, but at times your location was better not in the middle of it. And I had those opportunities, but then there were other times that you were right there with them and working with the company commander, which is what I did.
So by then you were second lieutenant.
I was a perpetual second lieutenant. I never got a pay raise. I never got never got anything.
I don't think I've ever heard that phrase before, a perpetual second lieutenant.
No. I was junior. The guy that I replaced he was older than I in the first place, and he'd been in the job that I got probably almost 2 years, and he thought he never would go anywhere, and I came over the horizon, and I took over all those jobs that the youngest guy always got. I mean, there was weekend guard duty, and there was selling bonds, and there was doing all these kinds of things that were distasteful, and not much leave time. Well, we didn't really get much leave time once we got going. We spent 24/7 getting loaded and getting unloaded and moving around and all that, so leave wasn't a really big factor, or even time off. But he was glad to see me.
I bet he was.
Because he got no promotion. He never got to be beyond a second lieutenant, but his work was better for a while, and then it became no better than mine, and in fact even worse because he was badly hurt. But anyway, we spent time in training at Fort Jackson, and then we gathered together the best equipment we could, and we sealed it all up for overseas shipment, and we hauled it to, well, we took off from Manhattan, and we had to unload in Liverpool and go inland and unstick it. Cosmoline, have you heard of that?
You know, I wrote a column about Cosmoline because
Yeah.
it's impacted my life in many different ways since I was a small child, and a huge percentage of my readership is younger than you and me and had never had a clue what Cosmoline was.
There are better things.
But doing the research about Cosmoline and writing that column brought people out of the woodwork from almost every country in the world. Where can I buy Cosmoline? Our stuff
They
was all
miss it?
packed in the.
They miss it?
Some people are nostalgic about the weirdest things.
Yes.
Tell people about Cosmoline now for our viewers who have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, cosmoline is sort of a greasy, sticky adhesive substance.
That very well describes it,
Yeah,
greasy
that
sticky.
you smear on with your hands on iron things and on other delicate things like gunsights that would corrode. It's an anti-corrosive thing.
Yeah.
And when you're traveling overseas, you don't even have to get wet with seawater. The sea spray will do it. And
Oh, sure.
You end up with a rust bucket if you don't protect it like that. But putting it on is a very messy process, and taking it off is even worse.
Even worse. You
Even
got
worse.
it right.
And everybody gets in it, and it's necessary, and you trust that all those things you put together, and trucks and guns and all the other equipment, got there in a good piece, and the Cosmoline didn't leak, and nobody stole pieces off it, and all those kinds of things. And
Sometimes all those things did
all
happen.
those things
and
did happen. Yeah.
Cosmoline, it's funny. It only comes up in discussions
Yeah.
like this.
Well, it's an old
but there
timer.
are people who still buy and sell Cosmoline because they like that nostalgia. And even after the war, and in the late 40s and early 50s, when the schools were eligible to get military surplus items, you get a case of stuff and you didn't know what was going to be in it. It was a big deal to go into the gym and unload these big crates and find the spark plugs and engines
Yeah.
and generators and batteries and everything all coated with Cosmoline.
One of the best treasures you could get out of a package like that was fig pudding. Part of the GI
You've got to be kidding.
A
Fig
K
pudding?
ration or C ration, could be cheese, could be meat, or a jam, things like that. Fig pudding. You could criticize GI food any way you wanted to. The fig pudding was the best you ever
Was it
had.
really? And I never
my
got to
wife,
enjoy that delicacy.
Got onto one of those things, and she'd hunt for a day if she got an idea that there was some of that around. It's not done anymore.
Isn't that amazing? That's a new one.
Yeah, no, it was
That's
a
a
real,
first
real
for
treasure.
Hometown Cable.
Well, better than Grandma's
pudding.
fruitcake, I'll tell you. It was, and not much to it. It was just a taste.
Yeah. Cosmoline, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
It's a legend, you bet.
So you got there, and then what happened?
Well, we did Mets, and we moved in, and we began work. I was assigned to a infantry company commander, and we replaced another division, the 26th, the so-called Yankee Division, of which the National Guard in Vermont was a part.
Oh, yeah.
That's been decommissioned now.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist, but it's got a blue YD emblem. They were well tried. They had been through southern France, they'd been in North Africa, and they ended up in the Saar Valley is what that area is, the River Saar, great coal mining and iron mining country. But we took their places and took their foxholes. On about December 15 or 18, 1944, I replaced another forward observer. He was a good-looking blonde kid. I don't know his name. We came from the same ROTC unit.
Come on.
He was probably a year ahead
How
of me.
do things like that happen?
I don't know how they happened, but he didn't linger for small talk. None of them did. They left like ghosts in the wind, and there we were.
Yeah.
Well, I told these stories last Memorial Day. I was asked to tell some tales. Here we were. We had never heard a cannon fire in anger before. And
Were you 19 by then?
I was 20.
20.
20. I was 21. I hit 21 about the day I was assigned to this division. Go back to the ASTP. A large part of the people who were sent to fill up the 87th Division in about February of 1944 resulted from the collapse of the AFTC program. They were dumped out of school like going down a coal chute because things were hot and desperate in Europe, and they were filling 5,000 casualties a day, and they needed those 19-year-old bodies. So a large part of the people who were in our units were no older than 19. And I was an old man at 21, baby-faced at that. But anyway, there they were in foxholes that a battle-hardened unit had been in. I was told to go back behind lines, get some sleep, and we slept under our Jeep because tanks were running all around us, and that was a safe thing to do. But in the morning I woke up and we were on sort of a little hillside, and there was a farm across a short valley. It was, say, 200 yards away. And the farmyard was sort of walled and up with a little elevation. And there were these neat GI colored packages lying along the wall like a row of matches in a box, several rows. And I couldn't figure out what they were. I put my field glasses on them. They were the 26th Division that didn't make it.
Oh.
They were lined up waiting for graves registration, and I had never, until that time, attended a funeral or seen a dead body.
No kidding.
And all of those...
Isn't that amazing?
Well, it is. It is.
In your 20s and never had been to a funeral?
Never had. I'd been away when those things happened in my family.
Sure.
And just hadn't attended. But anyway, that was a setback. And then
oh boy,
we went up for dawn because we were supposed to get ready to go. And the German military knew exactly where we were, so the shelling started. And we took our first casualties. Never saw a German, nothing. They just knew where we were.
Yeah.
Dropped them in, and the calls of medic began, and all that kind of stuff. And then we got out and moved up to the first attack, and the company commander and I were perhaps 100 yards behind where the troops were moved to for their jump off across an open area and into some woods. And that was a very, very bad beginning. They didn't know any better. Nobody knew any better. I mean, you went right up to the top brass, and they knew what the copybook said, but they'd never done it before.
Oh, boy.
And there are lots better ways than to do that. And they, in 3 days that they were operating, they took some horrible casualties right first thing. And they walked into tank fire, and they walked into an entrenched position. And there's no way to avoid some of that, but they could have done it better, except how do you learn? That's called being bloodied, and it's tough, but it always happens. I was only there one day. The company commander didn't know what to use me for. I couldn't see anything. There were other units positioned with observers who could better see what was ahead of me than I could. So I essentially didn't do anything. But I was called back. Another man was sent up, and the concept of the artillery command was that the senior officers, namely the battery commanders who would be the next step up from me, ought to go up for a little seasoning, just so they'd have the experience. And they lost 2 battery commanders instantly with that program, which is a loss. I mean, they run the show back there with 100 men. My battery commander took my place. I don't think instantly, but within a day he was there with his radio man. And the shell landed directly in his foxhole. He died on the way to Europe, England to be fixed, and his right-hand man was killed instantly. Why I wasn't there, we don't know that.
Those explanations are not for us to know, I guess.
There were other events after that. We eventually came to a conclusion in mid-December because the Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a while for that to be identified and reacted to, but we were right up until that time always with the Third Army, and thereafter with the Third Army as well. Temporarily, we were the eastern unit of Patton's army, and west of us was the Seventh Army, General Patch. So for a couple of days, while Patton was wheeling his whole army around, we were still there and not called to move yet, and we were commanded by the Seventh Army. So I got patches from two places. They're not there at a different place, but anyway,
Yeah.
from the two armies. We were pulled out of a hillside position which had been fought over very badly, and there were still bodies around the foxholes and stuff, on Christmas Eve. It was one of two Christmases I have ever spent away from Plattsburgh.
Over the years, only one.
Probably the best Christmas that we all ever had, because we were off the lines 40 miles, I guess, stopped for the night in a tiny French village, and got our Christmas turkey, and then loaded up and spent a horrible 24 hours in frigid cold crossing France, some 200 miles, to get up to we were in reserve, so we didn't immediately go up. But we settled and got cleaned up and set up for a couple of days. But that was a terribly hard trip. Transporting infantrymen, they don't have vehicles that they own to haul them around. The Transportation Corps is called with trucks that look essentially like what's used now to haul silage,
Oh, yeah.
only much bigger. They're tractor-trailer kinds of things, high sides. And you load a company of infantrymen, like 150 men, in that, and haul them 200 miles in frigid weather. There's a canvas that can cover it, but you don't dare cover it for fear of air attack, and you can't defend yourself. Don't know where they're going, none of us did. We got lost at one point, and another young lieutenant who spoke French very ably bailed us out because he talked with the natives and got us
On the right track, huh?
Yeah. That was at the time when allegedly paratroopers had been dropped in the area we were passing through. It wasn't true, but the rumors were all over the place. And anyway, we got up to Reims, R-E-I-M-S, in France, which I was at again, and waited to be called. The arrangement that General Patton had for doing his duty was to send the first fighting units in essentially blind. Reconnaissance is the big thing. It was called a clash of armies, I think, which meant get out of these trucks, have a K-ration, and go find them. And they went through probably 3 or 4 miles of knowing the Germans were around, but not knowing exactly where until the first units came up against the defense line, which was a very sturdy defense line, and they got it all over again. They probably were about half strength. Say you start with 150, you got 75 that went to the next station. And they just got hammered. Again, I missed that. I wasn't in that first effort. But our whole armies, I mean, it went beyond our division commander to the corps commander to army commander. Should have known better, but they didn't. They were desperate to stop something, and there was an awful cost that went with that, because that happened. Those people hit that on December 30. Up until then, winter had been coming on. It was wet and damp and cold in France, the problem there was trench foot. On December 30, the weather changed. It was like pulling a curtain down. The temperature dropped 40 degrees.
Oh my.
Snow started, and Hitler guessed 100% right, because he was not threatened by the U.S. Air Force. For 10 to 15 days, the weather was terrible, and the snows built up, and everybody had the same trouble, of course. They did, and we did. But frostbite, freezing, machinery that didn't work, vehicles that slid off the road, and all those things, and just slogging through the snow up to your hips. That's what those people were doing. And it was just incredibly bad. You can go on for hours with stories that I have got and that I have seen. And that went on. That affair lasted about 5 days. They accomplished what they were going to do and drove the German army back a couple of miles, where they were established and dug in again by the first week of January. And it was the same thing all over again, open fields and up into hedgerows. And this time they were down to 30 men instead of not 50 per infantry company. I mean, you just can't imagine. Forward observers, like I was, were deeply involved in that, and they are just as endangered. Several were severely wounded already, so we were running short of them, just like the infantry were running short, and that meant that anybody who was fairly skilled and intelligent, or it was often communications people, were sent up, sergeants were sent up to replace second lieutenants to be forward observers. So some sergeants got lost. And my next turn after that came when we moved. Well, the unit I was with was that one first hit. I wasn't with it at that time. It came back, recovered. 3 days later, it was sent to plug a gap in a little town called Bonneru, B-O-N-N-E-R-U, Pretty Street, in Belgium, which was a country village. Well, let's see, we got a little map of it here. It won't show on the machine, but there were 1, 2, 3, 4 locations where we had people.
Where it shows in red down on
Yeah.
the lower left-hand side, Calvin can focus in on it.
That was spaced probably 300 yards across and 200 yards sideways, and 4 different strong points, put it that way. I was at point 4, which was sort of a communal building. Several families occupied it, and it was a very solid 3-story building, but the advantage of it was built into a hillside. So there was sloping ground behind it, which made it, number one, difficult for attacking vehicles to get at that building. We also had 24 people from the community living in the root cellar that was in the hillside, that was part of the cellar of this building. That's another story. The civilians never get written up. The victors write military history.
I know. I'd like to talk about the civilians. They have been.
That get torn apart and injured, and their livelihoods destroyed, and their buildings destroyed, don't get told about much. There have been several things investigated and written that are part of my story that I saw some of firsthand. But in that building were these 24 people, ranging from age 82 to 4 months.
Oh
And
my
they,
goodness,
they
no
were,
kidding.
They were in there,
A couple of families, you mean? Or you think? Several
five,
five
five
families?
families, five families, yeah. And there were several other clusters through the village. They gathered in the safer cellars while the war went on around their heads. These people were much snugger because they were dug into a
Yeah.
dirt bank and underground, and actually nobody but we knew they were there. But once we fought and lost and were marched out, they were marched out as well and taken back along this road to that little place, which is a nothing town. It's about a tenth of a mile back there.
Is that where
It
it
doesn't
says?
even show. It's
Oh,
that unimportant. It's a crossroads.
Just where
Yeah.
my finger is on this map.
It goes through the woods. And they were marched back in that snow. Of course, that was a well-traveled route because tanks came down that route to get at us.
Mhm.
And so it was open, all right. But here's people with a 4-month-old baby. Here's grandma, who's 82, who died of a heart attack along the way.
Oh,
And
really?
grandpa, who managed to survive, but he died down there at the end of the trip from the stress and the exertion and so on.
You can understand that fully,
Well, yeah,
can't you?
Yeah, yeah. And they some of the men would attempt to leave and go back to their farms to tend the livestock. Cows have to be milked twice a
Of
day,
course.
whether there's a war going on or not.
Yeah, they don't know. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, yeah. And every time they go back, there'd be more of their cattle that were dead and so on. But it was a real tough go. I was destined on January 6, 1945, to go up and serve with a unit of the regiment we ordinarily supported, which was stationed beyond this map up in the woods there.
Yeah.
I got up to the village and they said, "Stop, we're pulling them out. You don't go up there, you go up here into this strong point I speak of," which was another regiment, people I never saw before. But they were there, and so that village, for reasons nobody knows, was selected before January 6th to be one that was going to be hammered. It was singled out. They'd hammered other places, but it was the return of that little. It was the turn of that little village to be hammered. So on the 6th of January, when the previous unit was defending, they got pounded by artillery and infantry and tanks at least 8 times over the space of 24 hours.
Wow.
And I was no part of that. I wasn't there yet. On the next day, it was a little bit quieter, but still very, very confused because there were losses. The company commander was down to the rear of these other strong points, and his position got hit by tanks who were up on this hillside that I speak of. And they could shoot just like shooting ducks
Sure.
with tank guns, which had a range of 1,000 yards straight line. And they were just blown out of where they were, and they had to withdraw a couple of 100 yards for safety. So we were up there by January 6th without infantry communication, wire or radio. When I was ordered up in there, they'd had a fight in the morning, and I assisted while the process of pulling these other people out of the woods was concerned. I turned into a telephone operator then in a basement of another building, and walked them out and talked them out. I was talking this way and I was talking that way, and falling asleep on the telephone, and that annoyed people. But anyway, when I got sent up there, there was a lull. They had backed off for a while, but there were two dead tanks up in an area where I didn't get to that had been December 6th or January 6th activities. then the new unit that I was with started again the next day. They didn't give up. They came after us, and they came with possibly as many as 5 tanks on that day. Plus, and we were hit at least as many times, I guess. They pounded us with artillery. They pounded us, we learned later, with mortars, which are weapons that shoot a projectile up and it comes down and it's short range and it's high angle with a big explosion. Infantry have them as their close-up weapons, but these were as big as bushel baskets that were coming in. And we saw them. They mounted them on flatbed trucks, and they were just sitting back in there behind us a tenth of a mile and dumping them on the village. And it was not like anything that we had at the American Army. But we got doses of everything there was, and by the end of January 7, we had casualties. They sent out a night patrol that cut our wire connections, which had been reestablished the night of the 6th. We were reconnected and disconnected. So neither, the infantry had no contact. We had my radio. Infantry talked to infantry. They had a radio too, but theirs burned out or whatever. They talked to infantry command post over here. Artillery command post is way over here somewhere talking to me. The two could communicate, but there was so much confusion and so much going on that nobody thought to do it. The infantry didn't know what was going on up there. They stole a couple of my men and dragged them back down here to find out what the infantry was doing. And I was up there all by myself without my radio.
Lovely.
Yeah, and they didn't even ask me. You see, when you're in the artillery, yes, your leaders are artillerymen, but when you get with the infantry, you never forget that the infantry are the boss.
Yeah.
And so they do whatever they think, and there's other stories about that, but I was the communication to the artillery. They knew what I was doing. They were helping me. The infantry didn't know what they were doing. And as a result, in the minds of the infantry, on the 7th of January, we were the lost battalion. And they called another one of their units from off to our right, probably 2/10 of a mile, to send out a patrol to come looking for us, to see what was there. And they sent out 15 men through the woods who ran completely in to where the German army had its tanks.
Oh my.
And that was not good news. And again, everything is garbled with respect to what happened at that time. They either were all captured or all killed, and it was unknown because when people came after us to retake that place, there were many dead men in those woods where they would have been caught. It's unknown, it's unclear. Nobody's keeping records very well. And they're all talking at cross purposes. And so that's the way it was. We took up business again on the 8th of January with more attacks coming in, but without our communications by that time. And so it was me or nothing until my batteries froze, and that was it. There's nothing left to do.
Did you have a sense of doom at that time, or were you just, can you remember?
It depends on when you're talking about, because when it's going on, my special recognition was that by mutual agreement, we brought down, I called down artillery fire on our heads. We blasted our own position several times. And there was a little church beside us. We destroyed that. We destroyed other buildings in the village. We destroyed ourselves. And on the 8th, I did so well, I set fire to our house. So no matter what,
Boy,
they were mainly out of ammunition, and they were battle fatigued. The doughboys who were left, which wasn't a great crowd, maybe 20 all over the village, had the course a week before. And here they were doing it again, so that there were a lot of them hiding in the root cellar, some that disappeared in the night, and things like that. And there's no blame to assign. There comes a time when there's too much. And about this time, there was over in another part, one of the infantry company commanders called himself off the line.
Really?
And he'd had enough. Everybody knew he'd had enough, and never another word.
People who haven't been in that situation have no idea, do they?
No. Everybody has a different point where they can't do it anymore.
In my business as a crime victims advocate in the probation department, I use terms like post-traumatic stress disorder, various other syndromes, the names of which weren't even invented, or the concepts weren't invented back then.
Yeah.
We in the First World War, we called it shell-shocked. Then you mentioned battle fatigue. We didn't know what to call it, but it was
Right. Yeah.
it was great trauma.
Yeah.
And anybody who's never had their life on the line has no clue what we're talking about.
Or life's experiences,
Or life
loading up on them,
experiences.
just as you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. There's a point where the human psyche can't take it, and some of it's very shallow beneath the surface, and
Well,
some can hang
in
on for a long
wartime,
time.
the point I'm making is, in wartime, it's compressed.
Oh, yeah.
Some of us,
And it's not just ordinary harassment, it's life or death.
oh yes,
Which is a little
if
different as well.
you're not sure.
Yeah, yeah.
When you get up in the morning, whether that's going to be your last day on this hunk of mud.
Yeah, and that opens many subjects. What holds people together? I remember over in the SAR, there was a little bitty fella I met in a foxhole on a hilltop from where we were withdrawn eventually. He was the last guy in his squad still to be with him. He had come 15 days by that time, and he had come 5 or 6 miles, and there was nobody left except him. He was scarcely big enough to carry a rifle. And I wondered how a guy did that, and I asked him, and he said, well, when it's your turn, it's your turn. And that's the depth he went. One of the best soldiers, I would say. The most aggressive, smart fellow. He was a forward observer. He fought like an infantryman. We didn't have to do that. He did it because that's the way he wanted to do his job. He had the strength of his religious faith that carried him through. Others had other ways of dealing with it, but it ranged from religious faith to fatalism.
Yeah, that's quite a gamut too,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is. But, well, anyway, the time came when we couldn't do it anymore, so we had to decide. And by that time, there was just another lieutenant and me and a group of men who had to decide, and we kind of took a poll. You could get out and you could run, but you had to run across a couple of 100 yards of open field and go through a brook in dark uniforms against a snowfield, and that's not a good choice.
I can see that picture, yeah.
Yeah. So that we elected to surrender. And of course, that's where the emotional
Oh boy,
letdown occurs.
think about it.
First you have to make the choice, and then you have to execute it, and how can you trust people outside to call it quits just because you do? You don't know. And of course there are dozens of instances where they didn't.
Yeah.
And everybody knew those stories. There was a side issue of a guy, well, I'll call him Goldstein. He was Jewish, The dog tag you wore had a religious symbol on it. P for Protestant, C for Catholic, J for Jew, or H for Jewish. And he was not in our position, but he was in a similar position. He had to make a choice, and he decided the choice with his dog tag was not to surrender, so he tried to run, and he survived, but he got shot in the back departing, and that was another facet that you had to think about. Anyway, nobody pulled the trigger, and we got rousted out and marshaled out, put on the road very quickly, and headed up this little road to the village where their headquarters was. At that point, according to the Geneva Convention and according to practical considerations, I would say, the officers were separated from the enlisted men. That's Geneva Convention rules, that officers are peeled off separately. But also, you don't want any more leaders than you can need to have to cause difficulties. So there were two reasons for that. So I had two of us, another fellow, an officer who belonged to the same organization but had been out on patrol, and he got picked up and he ended in this same place. We got loaded into a supply truck that was full of empty gasoline cans and started our trip across Belgium on snowy roads, and had no idea where we were headed, except obviously we were going east.
What your fate might be at
But
that
yeah,
time.
nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
We were issued, I think, 2 loaves of black bread that were going to serve us as long as we would be on the road until someone.
2 loaves of black bread?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
it's a
Oh,
bowl.
yeah, I know what it looks like.
Yeah, and it's like cement.
Of course.
But that was our ration to take us goodness knows how long. Actually, we didn't probably eat for a couple of days. But the emotion is draining. It's fear. It's depression. You've lost. It's just complete. Well, it's essentially discouragement, disorientation, because you no longer are organized or, again, not in control of your fate. So I have no memory of how far that ride went, or when we started marching, which we eventually did. We passed through the area where the assault had occurred, passed through the remnants of the American Army. We saw a shattered army. It was, vehicles, weapons, blown apart, abandoned, burned out, and all the rest of it. When we went up the River Seine, going into France, we passed through the course where, when the big breakout occurred out of Normandy, Patton went around the end and they formed a pocket. And there were many roads leading from that pocket to the River Seine, which the German army was trapped in. And they were just hammered by the Air Force, and wreckage and carnage was piled up. And we were not on a level, but the wreckage could be seen on the bluffs above the river, where they came to the river with their armies. No place to go because the bridges were gone. And you could imagine what that scene must have been like. You got 100,000 people and horses. That's another subject. The German army had a great amount of its service of supply, food, ammunition, horse-drawn. It had a certain amount of its artillery still horse-drawn. And I've seen pictures of their defeat with horse-drawn things, but they all get blown up and die and such. And just farm animals too when they're being fought over. But that was what we saw of the German army. That's what I saw of the American army as we went through it. Same thing happened. So anyway, we ended up crossing, I should think, the northern part of Luxembourg on the way to the German border, or just north of it. Don't have any idea.
Yeah.
And we eventually became columns of prisoners where others were fed in and joined the stream. And we passed through, I recall, a village that had recently been strafed, a little country town, where the populace didn't care for us very much. Fortunately, they identified us as plain old foot sloggers and not aviators. Aviators would not have got through that town. There were some among us, but they didn't look like anything, and they were very glad. We didn't stop for small talk. And the guards hustled us through. They didn't want a situation. We eventually came to a city called Prum, P-R-U-M, with a diaresis over the U. That story was that during the years of Hitler's rise, he rebuilt his country from the Depression, from the effects of the First World War. And it was done in many ways, but major construction projects were part of it. He was planning for his defense, and he was planning for his offense. So he built railroad lines coming south through the Ardennes area, or coming south in Germany. These were in Germany, not in the Ardennes, but leading right to the doorstep. Many, many lines. Prum was a railroad head at the end of one of those lines. In addition to that, of course, he constructed the German defensive line, the Siegfried line, or the West Wall, as it was called. And the railroad line served to supply the West Wall, but also to supply an army that would be going through sometime, and that was part of the supply line. So at Prim, it was a major hub that was eventually, when it was captured, it was in the French zone, and there were huge ammunition dumps, German, around there and other things. French didn't care for the Germans very much at all, and they were in charge of cleaning up the ammunition, and did it with zeal. They warned the townspeople to get out of town because they were going to blow up 10,000 tons of ammo, and some people said, we're not going to leave our town. The French just said, well, you had your chance, and blew it up, and the explosion was something fantastic, and the casualties were something fantastic. That was a legend that came out a year or two after the war that we picked up. Now let me just look at another picture.
All right.
That church.
Oh, yes, that's beautiful.
Yes, it is. And when you've marched through the snow for goodness knows how many hours, and sometimes day and night, that's where we took shelter for the night in Prum. We were in the church, sleeping under the pews, and all the rest of it was school and the parish buildings and so on, but that was a military hospital. And that was a point, I think, where I was very grateful because it was 20 below, and we were at least not sleeping in a barn or whatever.
Yeah.
But that was a railroad head that Hitler had built. We went there when we took our tour. The buildings were absolutely recognizable. Most of what you go to, you can't tell.
We haven't mentioned, I don't think yet, about taking a tour, but you, many years after this was over, you did go back in
Yes.
1988, 89?
89. My advisor told me in 1989, yes.
My wife has the same kind of advice for me, and we share those things
Yes.
with no malice or forethought.
That's right.
Because I forget, and
No, it ain't.
sometimes she forgets, so we compliment each other.
89, some very able people that belonged to our infantry division who had kept up contacts. They went back and back and back, and they kept up with, on a first-name basis, with military organizations of a similar nature but more historic in Belgium, and decided after a while that they could put together tours. So this was the first tour they attempted, and the object was to sign up as many as you could handle and guarantee you were going to take them to a place that was special to them individually.
And it worked.
It worked. Every single person. I found several. This would be one, and the little village that we fought in would be another, and prison jail that I was in later after this was another, and other places, but I couldn't identify anything. Some fellows found their foxholes.
Come on. How would that be possible?
They're all right in the woods behind the village where we were fighting still. We
So
unloaded.
there would be indentations.
We unloaded right there, and they went into the woods and
44
said, "Well,
years,
never mind."
44,
Yeah.
45 years
Yeah.
later?
Yes.
Can you imagine, I mean, in light of even young kids
Yeah.
today, they know what the word foxhole means.
Sure.
They've read the stories and seen the movies.
Yeah.
It was probably, was it really emotional for you or not?
Not high emotion. I had, up until that time, I had seen enough of destitution and wrecked buildings, the countryside all chewed up, shattered trees, that until about 40 years out, 45 years out, I didn't care. I didn't want to go back. But this thing hit just right.
Isn't
Because it was people who thought they could do it and who guaranteed delivery.
Yeah.
And that made it
And
different.
so you don't regret having
Oh,
done that?
no. That was very valuable, and
Okay.
she went with me.
Well,
So that would be even more valuable.
what I want to do is just take a little break so we can digest
Yeah.
the ground that we've covered. It's a lot for me to digest, to listen to this story that you're delivering so matter-of-factly, but we know what a great impact it had on you and on those with you. We'll continue our story with Robert Booth in a moment. We paused to take stock, and we're going to go for a few more minutes on this program, and then we're going to do a chapter 2 down the road, perhaps later on this summer or fall, and we'll do enough chapters until we finish this story. If one of us doesn't drop, and I know it won't be
Hurry
you.
up.
I know it won't be
Hurry
you.
up.
So, what point are we at now?
Well, we're at an overnight in the chapel, cathedral it might
Yes.
even have been. And from there, we continue down the same road and along Hitler's railroad that I was talking about, and perhaps 10 or 15 miles down the line, we come to a town called Gerolstein. And Gerolstein was famous in history in legend, because there was a little neighborhood village that in legend appeared every 100 years, just like Brigadoon.
No kidding.
And that was the story in Gerolstein. And
I love it.
I don't know how I got onto that, but
That's neat.
in Gerolstein, we were bunked in a factory building that was near the railroad for several days. And we were quartered in stalls, sort of like half the shape of this table, a cube, boxes, 4 or 5 deep up the wall. The enlisted men were in warehouse space, and it was a damaged building. The floor was wet, and there were men in there who had been casualties. They were suffering frostbite injuries. If you've ever seen a gangrenous foot, it turns purple and eventually falls off, or you die, or something like that, and no medical care. And the food supply and the rations were terrible, and there was a sergeant named of Eisenhower, who was a small-size bully who by reputation had taken offense by something some poor soldier had done, shot him between the eyes, so he was a legend. I had the pleasure, when I was debriefed after being liberated, of telling Eisenhower's story, and so had some others I was not a certified witness, but I told the story, and lately have learned that he was tried and hung as a war criminal.
No kidding.
So
And you
that
didn't
was-
know that up until
No,
fairly?
that's just recent information. and
wow.
I believe it's right. I'm not sure. I have no way of checking. But anyway, we left Gerolstein, and at some point, we were marching at night. And we were passing through an area that was like any others, except all of a sudden, a night-flying airplane came over our column, 600 miles an hour, and rocketed an installation right off our right side, 100 yards away, something like that. Well, it was one of the fabulous night fighters that was manufactured in Buffalo, New York, a Bell Air Cobra, and it was attacking a missile, a V-1 missile site. We had heard those things going over our heads, headed for Britain or Brussels or something like that.
Did you have any clue what it was at
What?
the time? Did you know they were V1s?
We knew
Did
we
you
were in
know?
the area they were being launched from.
So you know about
They went
rockets.
over us, yeah.
okay.
Oh, yeah, we knew about those things. But anyway, that was exciting. And then we came to a place called Mayen, which was on the railroad, Hitler's Railroad again, probably 20 miles from the Rhine, and we're loaded in boxcars for the first time. The 40 and 8 boxcar is legendary in all over Europe, but in France because the soldiers of World War I rode in them, meaning 40 men and 8 horses, or 8 horses, not all at once. We were 60 men or something like that, crammed in, sick, dysentery, locked in, and hauled in daytime and in darkness with many interruptions, because every time an air alert came, they stopped. They tried to hide the engine and left us locked in.
Lovely.
And that happened. That's why it took probably fully a day and a half to go 75 miles to a prison camp called Limburg, which was well into Germany and up on the River Lahn. I was at Limburg from probably 18th or 20th of January until about the same time in February, a full month. I've got pictures we can show perhaps later. They'll take a little time.
We've got a lot of
Of
pictures.
conditions there, and that was a long story. The legend of Tom Barry and conditions at Limburg, and then that leads to my inquisition in a castle.
And we've got pictures of the castle.
We got pictures
We got
with
pictures
all of those.
of the very room. We've got pictures from the very room.
Right.
And plus a lot of other memorabilia to show next time. I know that those people who are viewing this program today will want to see Chapter 2. We can't promise you when we're going to record it, but we can promise you that we will. This is a story that must be told. I don't know if it's ever been told in one whole piece before.
It's been written largely.
It's been written largely, but we're going to give pictures so that people get a little perspective, because when you went back, you did take a lot of photographs.
Took some when we went back.
We're going to try to recall the emotion of the trip and the emotion of the original experience and show our viewers a lot more, so they'll get an idea, especially the younger viewers, of what this war was all about. And we might even talk about how you feel about wars before we finish.
Yes.
We're at the home of Robert Booth in Plattsburgh. Helen's in the background, the silent partner today only, and maybe at the very end we can get her to chime in person here. But we thank both of you
She
for...
has things to say.
Oh, I know, she has things to say. We thank you so much for inviting us into your home, Robert and Helen. And somebody once said, "We'll be back."
I don't take that as a threat. No,
Who knows where
That'll be
we're
fun.
going to be next time for our little corner.